I watched the black sedan pull into the circular driveway of Hillcrest Manor, its engine purring to a stop beneath the towering oak trees that had stood sentinel over this estate for nearly a century. Through the rain-streaked windshield, I could see them all filing out one by one. Patricia Thompson emerged first, clutching her worn leather purse like a shield, her silver hair perfectly styled despite the October drizzle. Robert followed, straightening his Sunday-best tie, the one he only wore to funerals and court dates. Then came Jessica, my sister-in-law, practically floating across the wet gravel in her new black dress, the price tag probably still tucked discreetly inside the collar. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Tyler shuffled behind her, hands shoved deep in his jacket pockets, avoiding eye contact with everyone. Even Michelle had driven down from Portland, her BMW gleaming despite the weather, her lawyer husband no doubt waiting by the phone for updates. They were all here. Every last Thompson who had spent the past 4 months treating me like I was invisible, like my voice didn't matter, like my news wasn't worth acknowledging. The same people who had rolled their eyes when I shared my joy, who had changed the subject when I mentioned nursery plans, who had somehow forgotten to include me in family photos at the last gathering. Now they stood outside Eleanor Mitchell's estate, their faces a mixture of grief and barely concealed anticipation, waiting for the reading of a will that would change everything. I pressed my hand against my growing belly, feeling the flutter of movement that had become constant these past few weeks. 20 weeks now. Nearly halfway through carrying a child that half my family had pretended didn't exist. My baby kicked against my palm as if sensing my tension, and I whispered softly, "It's okay, little one, today, everything changes." Marcus squeezed my shoulder from the driver's seat. "You ready for this, Becca?" His voice carried that gentle strength I'd fallen in love with 6 years ago, when he was just the rookie firefighter who'd responded to the kitchen fire at my apartment and stayed to help me clean up the smoke damage. "Remember, whatever happens in there, we face it together." I nodded, though my stomach churned with something that had nothing to do with morning sickness. "I just wish Eleanor could have met them," I said, watching the family gather near the mansion's imposing front entrance. "She would have been so excited about becoming a great-great-aunt." "She knew," Marcus said firmly, "that letter she sent after you told her the news. She was thrilled, Becca, that's what matters." The story really begins 8 months earlier, in the cramped teacher's lounge at Riverside Elementary, where I was grading third-grade math tests during my lunch break, and trying to work up the courage to take the pregnancy test hidden in my purse. Marcus and I had been trying for 2 years, through fertility appointments and ovulation calendars and the kind of hope that builds and breaks in monthly cycles. When those 2 pink lines finally appeared, I cried right there in the school bathroom, clutching the plastic stick like it was made of gold. I called Marcus first, catching him between calls at the fire station. His whoop of joy was so loud that I heard his crew cheering in the background before he even told them the news. Then I called Eleanor, my husband's great-aunt, the woman who had become more of a grandmother to me than my own family ever was. At 87, Eleanor Mitchell was sharp as a tack and twice as fierce, living alone in that sprawling Victorian manor she'd inherited from her late husband's family. She'd made her fortune buying and selling properties across Oregon, turning rundown buildings into beautiful homes for young families. "Oh, my dear girl," Eleanor's voice had trembled with emotion when I shared the news. "A baby, how wonderful. You know, I was beginning to think I'd never live to see another generation join our family." She paused, and I could hear her smile through the phone. "This child is going to be so loved, Rebecca. So very loved." That conversation lasted nearly an hour, with Eleanor asking about due dates and doctor visits, and whether we'd picked out names yet. She promised to knit blankets and insisted on setting up a nursery in the manor for whenever we visited. Every great-great-aunt needs a proper space for spoiling babies, she declared with the authority of someone who'd spent decades getting exactly what she wanted. The contrast was stark when I shared the news with the Thompson family the following Sunday at their traditional dinner gathering. Marcus and I had planned it carefully, waiting until everyone was seated around Patricia's dining room table, the good china gleaming under the chandelier that had belonged to Robert's mother. The conversation had been flowing around typical family topics: Tyler's latest job search, Jessica's complaints about their landlord, Michelle's husband's promotion at his law firm. "We have some news to share," Marcus announced, his hand finding mine across the table. The room quieted, all eyes turning toward us with the kind of expectant attention I'd been hoping for. "Becca and I are expecting. We're having a baby." The silence that followed felt like a physical weight pressing down on the room. Patricia's fork paused halfway to her mouth, a piece of pot roast dangling forgotten. Robert cleared his throat and reached for his water glass. Jessica's expression didn't change at all, as if I'd announced something as mundane as the weather forecast. Tyler mumbled something that might have been congratulations, but his attention was already drifting back to his phone. "Well," Patricia finally said, setting down her fork with deliberate precision, "that's nice, dear." Then, without missing a beat, she turned to Michelle. "How's the house hunting going in Portland? Find anything in your price range yet?" That was it. 27 words, and then the conversation moved on as if the most important announcement of my life had never happened. Marcus's jaw tightened, and I felt his hand squeeze mine under the table, but neither of us pushed. We'd learned over the years that confronting the Thompson family's indifference only made gatherings more uncomfortable for everyone. The pattern continued over the following weeks. When I mentioned my first prenatal appointment, Jessica changed the subject to her new diet plan. When I showed Patricia the ultrasound photos, she glanced at them politely and handed them back without comment. When I started showing and needed to buy maternity clothes, the family conversation somehow never included questions about how I was feeling, or whether we'd learned the baby's gender yet. It wasn't malicious, exactly. The Thompsons weren't cruel people. They were just indifferent. I was Marcus's wife, the teacher he'd married, the quiet girl from California who'd moved to Riverside, and somehow never quite fit into their tight-knit farming family dynamic. They included me in gatherings, and remembered my birthday, but I'd always felt like a polite stranger at their table, someone to be civil to rather than someone to truly embrace. The indifference stung more as my pregnancy progressed. When I reached the second trimester and the morning sickness finally eased, I'd hoped the visible signs of my growing belly might spark some interest. Instead, family photos were taken at angles that somehow excluded me. Conversations about the future focused on everyone except the new family member who'd be joining us soon, and my excitement felt increasingly isolated to just Marcus, Eleanor, and my best friend Amanda. Amanda Rodriguez had been my saving grace through it all. We'd met during my first year teaching in Riverside, both young women trying to build lives in a small town where everyone else had deep roots and established connections. She'd married a local boy too, but her husband's family had embraced her from day one, welcoming her traditions and celebrating her successes as if she'd been born into their clan. She listened to my frustrations with the kind of understanding that only comes from someone who knows what it's like to be the outsider trying to belong. "They're idiots," Amanda declared over coffee one afternoon, watching me struggle to button my regular jeans. "This baby is going to be amazing, and they're going to regret not being excited from the beginning." She leaned across the table at Murphy's Cafe, lowering her voice. "You know what I think? I think they're jealous." "Jealous of what?" I asked, finally giving up on the.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Jeans, and reaching for the maternity pants I'd brought as backup. "Of you and Marcus. You two have something real, something solid. You're building a family based on love, not just tradition and obligation." Amanda stirred her latte thoughtfully. Jessica's been trying to get pregnant for 3 years, right? And Tyler can barely keep a job, let alone think about starting a family. Maybe seeing you succeed at something they're struggling with is harder than they want to admit. I hadn't considered that perspective, but it made a certain kind of sense. Jessica had made several comments over the years about wanting children, and Tyler's girlfriend had left him the previous spring, citing his lack of direction as one of the reasons. Still, their indifference felt too complete, too consistent to be explained by simple jealousy. Eleanor, meanwhile, became increasingly involved in our pregnancy journey. She called weekly to check on my health, sent care packages filled with herbal teas and prenatal vitamins, and started researching the best pediatricians in Riverside. When we learned we were having a girl, Eleanor cried actual tears of joy, and immediately began planning a nursery theme around vintage storybook illustrations. "I've always regretted not having children," she confided during one of our phone calls. "Harold and I tried for years, but it wasn't meant to be. This baby feels like a gift I never expected to receive." Her voice grew thoughtful. "You know, Rebecca, I've been thinking about legacy lately, about what we leave behind when we're gone. This little girl is going to carry forward the best of all of us." Those conversations with Eleanor sustained me through the family gatherings, where my pregnancy remained a non-topic, through the baby shower that Patricia attended but seemed to endure rather than enjoy, and through the gradual realization that my daughter would be born into a family where half her relatives had already decided she wasn't particularly interesting or important. The irony was that Eleanor's own relationship with the Thompson family was complicated. As Harold Mitchell's widow, she wasn't technically a blood relative, but she'd maintained connections with Robert's side of the family for decades after her husband's death. She'd helped them through financial difficulties, provided college funds for the grandchildren, and been a steady presence at major celebrations and milestones. Yet there was always an underlying tension, a sense that the family appreciated her generosity, but didn't quite know how to reciprocate her affection. Eleanor lived alone in Hillcrest Manor, the grand Victorian estate that had been in her late husband's family for generations. The house sat on 50 acres of rolling hills overlooking the Willamette River, with gardens that Eleanor maintained with the help of a part-time groundskeeper, and rooms filled with antiques that told stories of a century of Oregon history. She'd hosted Christmas gatherings there for years, opening her home to the extended family, and creating the kind of holiday memories that people treasure for lifetimes. But as Eleanor aged and her mobility became more limited, the family visits grew less frequent. The drive from town was only 20 minutes, but somehow 20 minutes felt too far for regular check-ins or casual afternoon visits. Marcus and I made a point of visiting monthly, helping with household tasks, and simply providing companionship to a woman who'd lived independently for decades, but was beginning to feel the weight of true solitude. During my second trimester, those visits became even more meaningful. Eleanor would place her weathered hands on my growing belly and tell stories about the babies she'd known throughout her long life, painting pictures of first steps and first words, and the indescribable joy of watching a new person discover the world. She'd show me photo albums filled with pictures of children who'd grown up and moved away, pointing out family resemblances, and sharing memories of birthday parties and summer adventures at the manor. "This house needs a child's laughter again," she said one afternoon as we sat in her sunroom, watching the river wind through the valley below. "It's been too quiet for too long." She turned to me with eyes that still sparkled despite her age. "Your daughter is going to love it here. The gardens, the secret passages Harold's grandfather built between the walls, the library with books that go back generations. There's so much history waiting for her to discover." I treasured those conversations, partly because they fed my excitement about becoming a mother, but also because they provided the enthusiastic family support I wasn't finding elsewhere. Eleanor's joy was infectious, her planning was detailed, and her love for my unborn child felt genuine and deep. She ordered a custom rocking chair from a local craftsman, started collecting vintage children's books for the manor's nursery, and even began researching family traditions she wanted to share with the newest generation. The Thompson family, meanwhile, continued their pattern of polite disinterest. They asked generic questions about my health when pressed, attended the baby shower Amanda organized, and made appropriate noises about being excited to become aunts and uncles and grandparents, but their enthusiasm felt obligatory rather than authentic, performed rather than felt. Jessica, in particular, seemed to view my pregnancy as an inconvenience that disrupted the family's established dynamics. She'd been the youngest daughter-in-law before I joined the family, and she'd held that position for nearly a decade. My pregnancy threatened to shift attention and resources toward Marcus and me, potentially diminishing her own standing in the family hierarchy. She never said anything directly, but her body language spoke volumes. The way she'd turned slightly away when I mentioned doctor's appointments, the subtle eye rolls when Eleanor called during family gatherings to check on my progress, the careful editing of social media posts to exclude my growing belly from family photos. Patricia and Robert's response was more complex. They seemed genuinely pleased about becoming grandparents in theory, but they struggled to express that pleasure in ways that felt personal or specific to our situation. They'd managed to raise 3 sons and guide them through marriages and careers, but they approached my pregnancy like it was happening to someone else's family rather than their own. They were supportive in the abstract but absent in the details, willing to offer help if asked directly but never volunteering the kind of eager involvement that I'd hoped grandparents might provide. As my due date approached and Eleanor's health began declining more noticeably, the contrast between her excitement and the family's indifference became even more pronounced. Eleanor's calls became more frequent, her questions more detailed, her planning more urgent. She seemed to sense that time was becoming precious, that her opportunity to be part of this baby's story might be limited. The call came on a Tuesday evening in late September, just as Marcus and I were finishing dinner and discussing nursery furniture arrangements. Patricia's voice on the phone was steady but strained, carrying news that we'd been expecting but weren't prepared to hear. Eleanor had suffered a massive heart attack that afternoon while working in her garden. The paramedics had done everything possible, but she'd passed away peacefully at the hospital, surrounded by flowers she'd cut from her prize-winning roses. The funeral drew family and friends from across the state, filling the small church in downtown Riverside with people whose lives Eleanor had touched through decades of quiet generosity and steadfast friendship. Marcus and I sat in the front pew with the Thompson family, my 7-month pregnancy belly making it difficult to stand during hymns, but impossible to hide the visible reminder of the great-great-niece Eleanor would never get to hold. The service was beautiful, filled with stories of Eleanor's kindness and community involvement, her business acumen and her dedication to preserving local history. But what struck me most was how many speakers mentioned her excitement about the coming baby, how she'd talked to friends and neighbors about becoming a great-great-aunt, how she'd shown off ultrasound photos like they were portraits of the most beautiful child ever born. Eleanor Mitchell lived for family, the pastor said during his eulogy, and in her final months she found new joy in the promise of a new generation. She often spoke about the continuity of love, about how each child carries forward the best of those who came before. His eyes found mine across the congregation. Though she won't be here to welcome this baby in person, her love will be present in every moment of that child's life. The words brought tears I'd been holding back for days, tears for the relationship my daughter would never have with the woman who'd loved her most completely before she was even born. After the service, as we gathered at the manor for the traditional meal, I found myself wandering through rooms that Eleanor had prepared for a baby she'd never meet, touching the rocking chair she'd commissioned and the shelves of books she'd collected for bedtime stories she'd never read aloud. That's when David Harrison, Eleanor's lawyer, approached me quietly and asked if Marcus and I could stay after the other family members left. He had some legal matters to discuss, he said, some final details about Eleanor's wishes that needed immediate attention. The request seemed routine enough, the kind of administrative cleanup that follows any death, so we agreed without thinking much about it. We had no way of knowing that Eleanor Mitchell's final act of love would transform not just our daughter's future, but the entire dynamic of a family that had spent months treating us like we barely mattered at all. Part 2. The Foundation Story. The path that led me to that lawyer's office began in the most ordinary way possible, in a classroom that smelled of chalk dust and childhood dreams. I'd moved to Riverside, Oregon 5 years earlier, with nothing but a teaching degree, a beat-up Honda Civic, and the kind of optimism that comes from believing you can make a difference in the world one third grader at a time. I'd grown up in Sacramento, the middle child in a family where achievement was expected but rarely celebrated, where good grades were assumed and anything less was a disappointment that lingered over dinner conversations for weeks. Teaching had been my escape route, my chance to build something meaningful away from the constant comparisons and conditional approval that had defined my childhood. When the position at Riverside Elementary opened up, offering me a chance to start fresh in a small Oregon town, where nobody knew my history or my family's expectations, I jumped at the opportunity without looking back. The salary was modest, the apartment I could afford was tiny, but for the first time in my adult life, I felt like I was building something that belonged entirely to me. Those early years in Riverside were a masterclass in resilience and determination. My one-bedroom apartment above the flower shop on Main Street had thin walls, unreliable heating, and a kitchen so small that I had to choose between opening the refrigerator or the oven, never both at the same time. I furnished it with second-hand finds from garage sales and the local thrift store, creating a space that was humble but entirely mine. Every mismatched dish, every slightly worn piece of furniture represented a choice I'd made, money I'd earned, a life I was constructing piece by careful piece. The teaching salary covered my basic expenses with little left over for luxuries or emergencies. I learned to cook simple meals from scratch, to mend clothes instead of replacing them, to find entertainment in library books and hiking trails that cost nothing but time and energy. My social life revolved around school events, and the occasional dinner out with other teachers, women who understood the particular challenges of shaping young minds, while managing classroom supplies purchased with our own money and lesson plans that stretched far beyond official work hours. I threw myself into my work with the kind of passion that sometimes worried my principal, who'd find me at school on weekends preparing elaborate science experiments, or creating reading corners that transform sterile classroom space into magical learning environments. My students became my purpose, their breakthrough moments my greatest rewards. When shy Emma finally raised her hand to answer a question, when struggling David mastered long division after months of patient practice, when creative Zoe discovered that her stories could make classmates laugh and gasp with wonder, those victories felt more meaningful than any promotion or raise could have been. But it was lonely work, especially in a town where most people my age had grown up together, attended the same high school, married childhood sweethearts, and built lives around extended family networks that went back generations. I was the outsider teacher, welcomed professionally but never quite invited into the deeper social circles that formed the backbone of small-town community life. I attended school board meetings and holiday concerts, participated in fundraisers and volunteer events, but always felt like I was observing rather than belonging, contributing rather than connecting. That's the context that made meeting Marcus feel like such a gift. The kitchen fire in my apartment happened on a Thursday evening in November, the result of my inexperience with the ancient gas stove, and a pot holder that turned out to be less fire-resistant than advertised. The flames were small but scary, confined to the stovetop but producing enough smoke to trigger every alarm in the building, and send me into a panic about losing the little I'd managed to accumulate. The fire department responded within minutes, 3 trucks for what turned out to be a minor incident that was extinguished before any real damage occurred. But the smoke had permeated everything, leaving my small space smelling like a campfire, and my nerves rattled in a way that surprised me with its intensity. I stood in the hallway outside my apartment, wrapped in a coat thrown over pajamas, watching the firefighters check for hidden embers and feeling foolish about the whole situation. Marcus Thompson was the rookie on the crew that night, barely 6 months out of training, but already carrying himself with the quiet competence that would later make him one of the most respected firefighters in the county. While his colleagues handled the technical aspects of the call, he took charge of what he called the human element, making sure I was okay, helping me understand what needed to happen next, and somehow managing to make me feel less like a disaster-prone fool, and more like someone who'd simply had an unfortunate encounter with an unreliable appliance. "These old buildings have character," he said, surveying the vintage stove that had caused all the trouble. "Unfortunately, some of that character includes appliances that should have been retired decades ago." His smile took the sting out of the observation, and his willingness to stay after the official call was complete, helping me open windows and set up fans to clear the smoke. Felt like kindness that went beyond professional duty. We talked while we worked, the kind of easy conversation that develops when two people are focused on a shared task, rather than the awkwardness of formal introduction. He'd grown up in Riverside, he told me, part of a farming family that had worked the same land for 3 generations. He'd tried college, studied business for 2 years before realizing that sitting in lecture halls felt like prison compared to the hands-on work he craved. The fire department had given him purpose and community, a way to serve his hometown while doing work that felt meaningful and immediate. I found myself sharing more than I'd intended, telling him about my journey from California, the challenges of starting over in a place where everyone else had deep roots, the satisfaction and loneliness of teaching in a small town. He listened with the kind of attention that made me feel heard rather than merely tolerated, asking questions that showed he was genuinely interested in my experiences rather than just making polite conversation. By the time my apartment was aired out and safe to occupy again, we'd been talking for nearly 2 hours. The rest of his crew had long since returned to the station, leaving him to finish up what had somehow become an extended first date disguised as emergency response follow-up. When he asked if I'd like to continue the conversation over coffee sometime when we weren't surrounded by the lingering smell of smoke and fire retardant, I said yes without hesitation. Our courtship unfolded slowly, with the deliberate pace of two people who'd learned to be careful with their hearts. Marcus introduced me to his family gradually, starting with casual mentions during our dates, progressing to invitations to larger gatherings where I could blend into the crowd, and eventually to the Sunday dinners that were sacred tradition in the Thompson household. I met his parents, Patricia and Robert, his brothers Tyler and the recently married Stephen, and Stephen's wife Jessica, who joined the family 2 years earlier, and seemed to have found her place with an ease I envied. The Thompson family operated with the kind of unspoken understanding that comes from generations of shared history and common purpose. They farmed together, celebrated together, weathered crises together, and made decisions with a collective wisdom that sometimes left me feeling like an anthropologist studying a fascinating but foreign culture. They were good people, hard-working and honest, committed to community and family in ways that were both admirable and occasionally overwhelming for someone raised in a more individualistic environment. Patricia Thompson ran her household with the efficiency of a general and the warmth of someone who genuinely enjoyed feeding people and creating spaces where family could gather. She was endlessly busy, always cooking or cleaning or organizing something, but never in a way that felt frantic or stressed. Her kitchen was the heart of the family operation, a large comfortable room, where conversations flowed as easily as the coffee that seemed to brew constantly throughout the day. Robert was quieter, more reserved, but his presence anchored the family in ways that became clear over time. He was the decision maker when decisions needed to be made, the problem solver when problems arose, the steady voice of reason when emotions ran high. He worked the farm with Tyler and Stephen, managing crops and equipment, and the endless logistics of agricultural life with the kind of competence that made difficult work look effortless. Tyler, the youngest son, was still finding his place in the family structure. He was smart and capable but restless, cycling through jobs and relationships with a frequency that worried his parents and frustrated his brothers. He lived in a small house on the family property, helping with farm work when needed, but clearly searching for something that felt more personally meaningful than continuing the agricultural tradition that had sustained previous generations. Stephen and Jessica seemed to have found their rhythm as the newest married couple in the family. Stephen had always been the most business-minded of the brothers, interested in expanding the farm operation and exploring new revenue streams. Jessica had adapted to rural life with apparent ease, throwing herself into the role of farmer's wife with enthusiasm that impressed her in-laws and made her a natural ally for Patricia in all things domestic and social. I occupied an uncertain position in this family ecosystem during the 2 years Marcus and I dated. I was welcomed but not quite integrated, included but not essential, appreciated but not depended upon. The Thompsons were polite and kind, but they had their established patterns and relationships, and adding a new person to the mix required adjustments that nobody seemed quite sure how to navigate. The engagement changed some of that dynamic, giving me a more defined role as Marcus's chosen partner and future wife, but it also highlighted the ways I remained different from the family's expectations and experiences. I was educated but not practical in the ways they valued. I was independent but not particularly interested in the traditional domestic roles that Patricia and Jessica had embraced. I was committed to my teaching career in ways that sometimes conflicted with the family-first priorities that governed Thompson decision-making. Our wedding was a beautiful compromise between my smaller, more formal preferences and the Thompson tradition of large, elaborate celebrations that included extended family and half the town. We held the ceremony at the small church downtown and the reception at the manor, with Eleanor's enthusiastic permission and active participation in the planning. Eleanor had become an unexpected ally during the engagement period, someone who understood both my outsider status and my genuine love for Marcus, someone who helped bridge the gap between my vision of married life and the Thompson family expectations. The early years of our marriage were a continuation of that balancing act, finding ways to honor both my individual goals and our shared commitment to building a life together in Riverside. Marcus supported my teaching career even when it meant late nights grading papers and weekend school events that interrupted family time. I learned to appreciate the rhythms of farm life even when they felt foreign to my urban upbringing. We bought a small house on the outskirts of town, close enough to family for regular contact but far enough away to establish our own household traditions and priorities. The decision to start trying for children came naturally after 2 years of marriage, driven by our shared desire to build a family and by the gentle but persistent hints from Patricia about the joys of grandparenthood. We approached pregnancy planning with the same thoughtful deliberation we'd brought to every other major decision, researching prenatal health, adjusting our lifestyle habits, and creating financial cushions to support the costs of raising children. The months of trying tested both our patience and our relationship in ways we hadn't anticipated. The monthly cycle of hope and disappointment, the increasing awareness of our friends and family members who seemed to conceive effortlessly, the gradual shift from excited anticipation to anxious concern about whether parenthood would ever happen for us. We consulted doctors, tracked ovulation, adjusted diets and exercise routines, and slowly learned that some things couldn't be controlled or planned no matter how much preparation and effort we invested. The fertility appointments were particularly challenging, clinical and invasive in ways that stripped romance and spontaneity from what had once felt like the most natural thing in the world. We submitted to tests and procedures, followed protocols and schedules, and gradually accepted that creating life might require more medical intervention than we'd hoped or expected. The process was expensive, both financially and emotionally, straining our budget and our relationship in ways that required constant communication and mutual support. Marcus was patient and supportive throughout the ordeal, but I could see the disappointment in his eyes each month when we received negative results. His family's casual questions about when we might have children became increasingly difficult to answer with optimism and good humor. The sight of pregnant women and new babies, once a source of gentle envy, became painful reminders of what we seemed unable to achieve despite our best efforts and medical assistance. The breakthrough came during our second year of fertility treatments, when a new protocol finally resulted in the positive pregnancy test we'd been praying for. The relief and joy were overwhelming, mixed with anxiety about whether this pregnancy would progress successfully after so many months of disappointment. We decided to wait until the second trimester before sharing the news widely, wanting to pass the highest risk period before inviting others into our excitement and hopes. Those early weeks of secret pregnancy were precious and terrifying in equal measure. Every twinge and symptom felt significant, every doctor's appointment carried the weight of our entire future, every day that passed without complications felt like a small victory worth celebrating privately. Marcus was attentive and protective in ways that were both touching and occasionally overwhelming, monitoring my every move and mood with the intensity of someone who understood how fragile this gift might be. When we finally felt confident enough to share our news with the world, we planned the announcement carefully, wanting to make the moment special for everyone who'd supported us through the difficult journey of trying to conceive. We chose the Thompson family Sunday dinner as the perfect setting, surrounded by people who we hoped would share our excitement and joy about this long-awaited addition to the family. Part 3. The symbol of independence. My home on Maple Street represented more than just a place to live. It was the physical manifestation of everything I'd worked to achieve in Riverside and the foundation upon which Marcus and I were building our future together. The modest two-bedroom house sat on a quiet corner lot, surrounded by mature maple trees that gave the street its name and provided a canopy of shade that made summer evenings on the front porch feel like a retreat from the world. We'd bought it during our engagement, pooling our savings for a down payment, and taking on a mortgage that felt manageable on our combined teaching and firefighter salaries. The house itself was nothing spectacular, a 1950s ranch-style structure with original hardwood floors, large windows that filled every room with natural light, and a layout that felt both cozy and functional. The kitchen was small but efficient, with enough counter space for my cooking experiments and a breakfast nook where Marcus and I shared our morning coffee and planned our days. The living room featured a brick fireplace that became the focal point for winter evenings, surrounded by bookshelves filled with my teaching resources and the mystery novels Marcus devoured during his off-duty hours. What made the house special wasn't its architectural features or modern conveniences, but the way it felt completely ours in a way that nothing else in my adult life ever had. Every paint color was chosen together, every piece of furniture selected to reflect our shared taste and practical needs. The walls displayed our wedding photos alongside Marcus's firefighter commendations and my teaching awards, creating a visual narrative of our individual achievements and shared commitment to serving our community. The second bedroom had been converted into my home office, a space where I could grade papers and plan lessons without spreading school materials across the dining room table. During the pandemic years, when remote learning became necessary, this room had been my classroom, equipped with the technology and supplies needed to teach third graders through computer screens. The space had evolved to meet my professional needs while maintaining the personal touches that made it feel like sanctuary rather than just workspace. The backyard was where Marcus's farming background showed most clearly, with raised garden beds that produced vegetables throughout the growing season and a small greenhouse where I started seedlings for both our garden and my classroom science projects. He'd built a deck off the kitchen where we hosted barbecues for my fellow teachers and his firefighter colleagues, creating the kind of informal, entertaining space that brought together different parts of our social world in ways that felt natural and welcoming. We'd spent countless hours working on home improvement projects, learning skills from YouTube videos and Marcus's family members, slowly transforming the house from a solid but unremarkable structure into something that reflected our personalities and priorities. I painted accent walls in colors that made me happy, while Marcus installed ceiling fans and upgraded electrical fixtures with the patience and precision he brought to all his handiwork. We haunted garage sales and estate sales on weekends, hunting for vintage pieces that could be restored and repurposed to add character to rooms that had felt generic when we first moved in. The financial investment in the house was significant but manageable, requiring careful budgeting and occasional sacrifices in other areas of our lives. We postponed vacations to afford new appliances, ate more meals at home to save for property taxes, and learned to be creative with entertainment options that didn't strain our budget. But every payment felt like progress toward true ownership. Every improvement increased both our equity and our emotional attachment to the space we were creating together. The house also represented our commitment to staying in Riverside long term, putting down roots in a community where we both felt valued and useful. Many of our college friends had moved to larger cities in pursuit of higher salaries and more diverse opportunities, but we'd chosen stability and community connection over the uncertainties of starting over somewhere new. Our mortgage was proof of that commitment, a 15-year plan that would see us owning our home outright while we were still young enough to enjoy decades of mortgage-free living. During the fertility struggles, the house had provided both comfort and painful reminders of our hopes for the future. The second bedroom that served as my office had been planned with the understanding that it could eventually become a nursery when children arrived. We'd chosen a neutral paint color that could work for either purpose, installed good lighting that would support both computer work and nighttime feedings, and maintained the flexibility to transform the space when the time came. The neighborhood itself was perfect for raising children, with sidewalks safe for bicycles and tricycles, neighbors who looked out for each other's families, and easy walking distance to the elementary school where I taught. I could envision my future children making the same walk to school that I made every day, perhaps stopping to visit Eleanor at the manor on their way home, becoming part of the community fabric in ways that would connect them to both their immediate family and the broader network of relationships that define small-town life. When the positive pregnancy test finally came, the house took on new significance as the place where we'd raise our daughter, where she'd take her first steps and speak her first words, where Marcus would teach her to ride a bicycle, and I'd help her with homework at the kitchen table where we'd shared so many meals and conversations. Every room became part of an imagined future filled with the ordinary moments that create extraordinary memories over the course of a childhood spent in a place that feels safe and loved. I began subtle preparations for the nursery conversion, researching cribs and changing tables, considering color schemes that would work for a baby girl, planning the logistics of transforming my office space into something designed for our daughter's needs rather than my professional requirements. The changes felt premature during those early weeks when we were still nervous about the pregnancy's viability, but they also felt necessary, small acts of faith that helped make the reality of impending parenthood feel more concrete and achievable. Marcus threw himself into more practical preparations, researching car seat installation and child-proofing techniques, planning improvements to the backyard that would create safe play spaces, and consulting with his brothers about the kind of swing set and sandbox that would provide years of entertainment and development opportunities. His excitement was infectious, and his practical approach to preparation helped balance my tendency toward anxiety about all the ways parenthood might challenge our carefully constructed life. The house also became the setting for our first attempts to share pregnancy news with family and friends, hosting dinner parties where we planned to make announcements and creating spaces where we could celebrate this new chapter with the people who mattered most to us. We invited both sets of parents for a weekend visit, planning to reveal the pregnancy news during a casual barbecue that would feel relaxed and festive rather than formal and pressured. Eleanor's response to our pregnancy news had included immediate offers to help with nursery preparation, sharing family heirlooms that could be incorporated into the baby's room, and promising to knit blankets and baby clothes during the long winter months when outdoor activities were limited by weather. Her enthusiasm and practical support made me feel connected to the broader family history that my daughter would inherit, part of a continuum of love and care that stretched back generations. The contrast between Eleanor's excitement and the Thompson family's muted response became more apparent as my pregnancy progressed and our home became the setting for conversations about the future that revealed different levels of interest and investment in our growing family. Eleanor called regularly to check on home preparation progress, offering advice about nursery layouts and baby-proofing strategies based on her decades of experience with children in her extended family networks. Patricia and Robert visited occasionally, offering polite compliments about our home improvements and general statements about their excitement about becoming grandparents, but their engagement felt obligatory rather than enthusiastic. They asked appropriate questions about due dates and doctor visits, but they didn't volunteer to help with nursery preparation or offer family items that might be useful for the baby's room. Jessica's response was more complex and harder to interpret. She complimented our home decorating choices and expressed appropriate enthusiasm about the pregnancy, but her body language suggested discomfort with conversations that focused too heavily on our future plans or the practical details of preparing for parenthood. I began to suspect that our pregnancy news had triggered complicated emotions related to her own desires for children and the challenges she and Stephen were facing in that area. The house became a refuge during the months when family interactions felt strained, and my pregnancy symptoms made social obligations more difficult to navigate. I could retreat to the nursery office and research baby products or read pregnancy books without feeling judged or questioned about my choices and priorities. Marcus and I could have private conversations about parenting philosophies and financial planning without worrying about family members who might have different ideas about how we should approach raising children. As my due date approached, the house felt increasingly like the perfect setting for the early months of parenthood, equipped with everything we needed to care for a newborn while maintaining the comfortable routines that had sustained our marriage through 5 years of building life together in Riverside. The nursery was ready, the practical preparations were complete, and the emotional foundation was solid enough to support the challenges and joys that lay ahead. But underlying all these preparations was a growing awareness that our daughter's arrival would change not just our household dynamics, but our relationships with extended family members who had different levels of investment in her future and different ideas about what role they should play in her life. The house represented our ability to create an independent family unit while remaining connected to the broader community, but it also highlighted the ways we sometimes felt isolated from family networks that operated according to different priorities and expectations. Part 4. Relationship Dynamics Revealed. Growing up as an only child in Sacramento had left me unprepared for the complex dynamics that governed the Thompson family hierarchy, where birth order and gender roles created invisible but powerful structures that determined everything from seating arrangements at family dinners to whose opinions carried the most weight in important decisions. Marcus occupied the middle position among 3 brothers, a spot that seemed to offer both advantages and disadvantages depending on the situation and the family politics involved. Stephen, the eldest son, had always been groomed for leadership within the family structure. At 32, he possessed the kind of quiet authority that comes from years of being consulted on major decisions and expected to set examples for his younger siblings. He'd married Jessica 3 years earlier, bringing into the family a woman who understood and embraced traditional roles in ways that made her an instant favorite with Patricia and Robert. Jessica had grown up on a ranch outside Portland, so she arrived with farming knowledge and domestic skills that impressed her new in-laws and made her integration into Thompson family life appear seamless and natural. The dynamic between Stephen and Jessica fascinated me because it seemed to represent everything the Thompson family valued in marriage and partnership. Jessica deferred to Stephen's judgment in public while exercising significant influence over family social activities and household management. She organized holiday gatherings, coordinated family photos, and somehow managed to be both independent and subordinate in ways that satisfied everyone's expectations about how daughters-in-law should behave within established family structures. Jessica's relationship with Patricia was particularly noteworthy, developing into something that resembled friendship more than the typical mother-in-law and daughter-in-law dynamic that often involved territorial disputes and competing loyalties. They worked together on cooking and decorating projects, shared recipes and household management strategies, and supported each other through the minor dramas and celebrations that punctuated family life. Jessica had earned her place at the family table through a combination of useful skills, appropriate deference, and genuine appreciation for Thompson family traditions and values. Tyler, the youngest son at 28, occupied a more precarious position within the family hierarchy. His unmarried status and uncertain career trajectory made him something of a wild card in family planning and decision-making processes. He was charming and intelligent, but his tendency to change jobs and relationships frequently created ongoing anxiety for parents who valued stability and long-term commitment above almost everything else. Tyler lived in a small house on the family property, close enough for daily contact but separate enough to maintain some independence from parental oversight and sibling obligations. The contrast between Tyler's situation and the married stability of his older brothers created subtle but persistent tension during family gatherings. Patricia worried openly about his future, wondering aloud when he might find the right woman and settle into the kind of life that would make him truly happy and successful. Robert expressed frustration with Tyler's job changes and lack of clear direction, though he continued to offer employment on the farm whenever other opportunities fell through or proved disappointing. Marcus's position between these two brothers had shaped his personality in ways that became more apparent as I spent time with the family and observed their interactions across different situations and stressors. He was responsible and reliable like Stephen, but less authoritative and more flexible in his approach to problem solving. He was adventurous and independent like Tyler, but more focused and committed to long-term goals and relationships. He seemed to serve as a bridge between his brothers, understanding both Stephen's perspective as the eldest and Tyler's struggles as the youngest, while maintaining his own distinct identity and priorities. The arrival of daughters-in-law had complicated these family dynamics in ways that weren't immediately obvious to outsiders, but became clear through months of careful observation and gradual insight. Jessica's successful integration had set a standard for how new women should fit into the Thompson family structure, creating expectations about domestic skills, social roles, and relationship styles that would apply to any future additions to the family network. My own integration process had been more challenging and less complete than Jessica's, partly because of my different background and priorities, but also because my relationship with Marcus had developed during a period when the family was already adjusting to significant changes and new responsibilities. I was welcomed but not embraced, included but not consulted, appreciated but not depended upon in ways that made my position within the family hierarchy uncertain and sometimes uncomfortable. The pregnancy announcement had the potential to shift these dynamics significantly, elevating my status from peripheral daughter-in-law to mother of the next generation, giving me new relevance and importance within family planning and decision-making processes. Becoming the mother of Patricia and Robert's first grandchild should have been a moment of celebration and increased connection, but instead it seemed to create new tensions and uncertainties about how my role would evolve and what expectations would accompany this change in status. Jessica's response to our pregnancy news was particularly revealing about the competitive elements that existed beneath the surface of family relationships. She'd been trying to conceive for over 2 years, a struggle that she'd shared with Patricia and other family members, but discussed only in general terms with Marcus and me. Our successful pregnancy represented not just a happy family development but also a painful reminder of her own reproductive challenges and uncertain timeline for achieving motherhood. The subtle changes in Jessica's behavior following our announcement were easy to miss unless you knew what to look for, but they suggested a level of resentment and disappointment that she was working hard to conceal behind appropriate expressions of excitement and support. She asked fewer questions about my pregnancy symptoms and doctor visits, changed the subject more quickly when conversations turned to baby preparations, and seemed to find reasons to be busy with other activities when family discussions focused on the future grandchild and what his or her arrival would mean for everyone. Patricia's response was more complex and harder to interpret, reflecting her genuine excitement about becoming a grandmother balanced against her awareness of Jessica's struggles and her desire to be sensitive to everyone's feelings and circumstances. She expressed appropriate enthusiasm about our pregnancy but was careful not to be too effusive or detailed in her questions and comments when Jessica was present. This created an atmosphere where my pregnancy became something to be celebrated quietly rather than joyfully, acknowledged rather than truly embraced by the extended family network. Robert's reaction was characteristically understated, but seemed genuinely positive, reflecting his practical approach to family developments and his appreciation for Marcus's maturity and readiness for fatherhood. He asked sensible questions about our financial preparations and made appropriate offers of support without overwhelming us with advice or expectations about how we should approach parenting. His response felt authentic and supportive while maintaining the kind of respectful distance that allowed us to make our own decisions about pregnancy and child-rearing approaches. Tyler's response was perhaps the most honest and least complicated, expressing straightforward excitement about becoming an uncle without the layers of expectation and comparison that seemed to influence other family members' reactions. He volunteered to help with nursery preparation and baby-proofing projects, offered to research car seat installation and child-proofing strategies, and generally approached the prospect of his niece's arrival with the kind of uncomplicated enthusiasm that made family interactions feel more natural and less fraught with hidden agendas. The extended family network that surrounded the Thompson core included aunts and uncles and cousins, who had their own relationships and history with Marcus and his brothers, creating additional layers of complexity in terms of how our pregnancy news was received and discussed within the broader family community. Some relatives were genuinely excited and supportive, others seemed more focused on their own family developments and challenges, and still others appeared to view our pregnancy as just one of many family updates that deserved polite acknowledgement but not particular attention or investment. Eleanor's position within this extended family network was unique and somewhat complicated, reflecting her status as a family member by marriage rather than blood, but also her role as the matriarch with the most resources and longest perspective on family history and traditions. Her enthusiastic response to our pregnancy news stood in sharp contrast to the more muted reactions from blood relatives, highlighting the ways that family relationships aren't always determined by genetic connections or official hierarchies. The pattern that emerged over the months following our pregnancy announcement suggested that family dynamics were more fragile and competitive than I'd initially understood, influenced by factors like reproductive success, financial stability, and perceived favoritism that created undercurrents of tension beneath the surface of apparently harmonious relationships. My pregnancy had disrupted established patterns and expectations in ways that revealed previously hidden resentments and anxieties among family members who were struggling with their own
challenges and disappointments. Understanding these dynamics became crucial as my pregnancy progressed and our daughter's arrival approached, because it helped explain why some family members seemed less enthusiastic about her impending birth than we'd expected and hoped. The pregnancy wasn't just a personal joy for Marcus and me, it was a family event that affected everyone's relative status and future position within the Thompson hierarchy, creating both opportunities for closer connection and risks of increased competition and conflict. Part 5. The Catalyst Event. The morning I decided to share our pregnancy news with the Thompson family dawned clear and crisp. One of those perfect October days in Oregon, when the autumn light turns everything golden and the air carries the scent of fallen leaves and wood smoke from distant chimneys. Marcus and I had spent weeks planning this moment, discussing how to make the announcement special and memorable for everyone who would become part of our daughter's extended family network. We'd chosen the traditional Sunday dinner gathering as our venue, reasoning that having everyone together in Patricia's comfortable dining room would create the kind of intimate, celebratory atmosphere that such important news deserved. I'd been carrying the secret of our pregnancy for 3 weeks by then, long enough to confirm the pregnancy with blood tests and an initial ultrasound, long enough to feel confident that this miraculous development was real and lasting, but not so long that keeping quiet had become unbearable. The 12-week mark was still 2 weeks away, but our doctor had been encouraging about the pregnancy's progress, and we felt ready to begin sharing our joy with the people who mattered most to us. The drive to the Thompson farmhouse took us through countryside that had become familiar over the 5 years I'd been part of Marcus's life, past fields where corn and soybeans were ready for harvest, past barns and silos that marked family farms that had been worked by the same families for generations. The landscape looked particularly beautiful that afternoon, painted in the warm colors of autumn and bathed in the kind of light that made everything seem more significant and hopeful than usual. Marcus was nervous in a way I rarely saw, fidgeting with the radio and checking his appearance in the rearview mirror as we approached his childhood home. "You sure about the timing?" he asked for the 3rd time since we'd left our house. "We could wait another month, maybe until Thanksgiving, make it part of the holiday celebration." I reached over and squeezed his hand, feeling the tension in his fingers and understanding the anxiety that was driving his second guessing. This announcement would change everything for his family, and despite his excitement about becoming a father, he was worried about how the news would be received and what expectations it might create. "She's going to be born into this family, whether we announce it today or next month," I reminded him, using the gender we'd started assuming even though it was too early for official confirmation. "I'd rather have them excited about her arrival than surprised by it." We'd talked extensively about our hopes for family support during the pregnancy and after the birth, dreaming about the kind of involved grandparents and aunts and uncles who would make our daughter feel surrounded by love and connection from her earliest days. The farmhouse looked particularly welcoming that afternoon, with Patricia's carefully tended flower beds still blooming despite the cooling temperatures and the wide front porch decorated with pumpkins and corn stalks that marked the advancing season. Smoke was rising from the chimney, and through the kitchen windows we could see the familiar scene of Patricia orchestrating the Sunday meal preparation that had been a family tradition for as long as Marcus could remember. We arrived to find Stephen and Jessica already there, helping with final dinner preparations and catching up on the week's activities with the comfortable familiarity of people who knew their roles and relationships within this family system. Tyler was running late as usual, but his place was set at the table and his absence was acknowledged with the kind of patient tolerance that comes from years of accepting someone's reliable unreliability. The atmosphere was warm and welcoming, exactly the kind of setting we'd hoped would make our announcement feel natural and celebratory. Patricia had prepared Marcus's favorite meal, pot roast with vegetables from their garden, homemade bread that filled the house with yeasty warmth, and apple pie made from fruit picked from the orchard behind the house. The table was set with her grandmother's china, the good pieces reserved for special occasions and family celebrations, creating an elegant backdrop for the kind of conversation and connection that define Thompson family gatherings at their best. The conversation during dinner was typical for these Sunday gatherings, ranging from farm business and weather concerns to local news and family updates from relatives who lived too far away for regular contact. Stephen talked about his plans for expanding the farm operation, Jessica shared news about a promotion opportunity at her job, and Robert discussed the county commissioner race that was generating unusual interest and controversy in their rural district. I participated in these conversations with the kind of attention and engagement that had become my standard approach to Thompson family gatherings, asking appropriate questions, offering relevant observations, and generally trying to be a contributing member of the family discussion without overwhelming anyone with my outsider perspectives or professional experiences that didn't always translate well to rural farming contexts. But throughout the meal, I was acutely aware of the secret Marcus and I were carrying, the news that would shift everyone's attention and potentially change the entire dynamic of these family gatherings for years to come. Every time Patricia mentioned future plans or Jessica talked about her work schedule, I found myself wondering how our pregnancy announcement might affect their thinking and priorities, how the prospect of a grandchild might influence family decisions about everything from holiday celebrations to long-term financial planning. Marcus was equally distracted, though he hid it better than I did, drawing on years of experience managing his emotions and reactions in family settings where his feelings needed to be carefully modulated to maintain harmony and avoid conflict. He participated naturally in the dinner conversation, asking his father about harvest plans and teasing Tyler about his latest girlfriend, but I could see the anticipation building in his eyes as we approached the moment we'd planned for sharing our news. Tyler arrived halfway through the main course, apologizing profusely for his lateness and explaining that he'd been helping a neighbor whose tractor had broken down at exactly the wrong moment during harvest preparations. His arrival shifted the energy at the table, bringing his characteristic combination of charm and chaos that always seemed to lighten the mood and create opportunities for the kind of spontaneous conversation that made family gatherings feel less formal and more genuinely connective. "So what's the big family news this week?" Tyler asked as he loaded his plate with the food that Patricia had kept warm for him. "Anyone getting married, divorced, arrested, or promoted since last Sunday?" It was exactly the kind of opening that Marcus and I'd been hoping for, a natural segue into the kind of announcement that would feel organic rather than staged or overly dramatic. Marcus looked at me across the table, raising his eyebrows slightly in the question we'd discussed beforehand. I nodded, feeling my heart rate accelerate as the moment we'd been planning finally arrived. "Actually," Marcus said, his voice carrying just enough weight to signal that something important was coming, "Becca and I do have some news to share." The table quieted in the way that family gatherings do when someone signals that a significant announcement is forthcoming. Patricia set down her fork and folded her hands in her lap, giving Marcus her full attention with the kind of focused interest that suggested she was expecting something momentous. Robert leaned back in his chair, his expression neutral but alert. Stephen and Jessica exchanged a quick glance that I couldn't quite interpret, while Tyler grinned with the anticipation of someone who genuinely enjoyed hearing about other people's good fortune and exciting developments. "We're expecting a baby," Marcus said simply, reaching across the table to take my hand as he spoke. "Becca's about 9 weeks along, and everything looks good so far. We're due in early May." The words hung in the air for a moment, and I found myself holding my breath as I waited for the explosion of excitement and congratulations that I'd been imagining for weeks. The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds, but it felt like much longer, stretching until it became uncomfortable rather than simply surprised. Patricia was the first to speak, her voice carefully modulated and pleasant but lacking the enthusiasm I'd expected. "Well, that's wonderful news, dear," she said, reaching across the table to pat my hand in a gesture that felt more obligatory than spontaneous. "How are you feeling? Are you managing the morning sickness all right?" Robert cleared his throat and offered what appeared to be a genuine smile. "Congratulations to both of you," he said, his tone warm but measured. "This is exciting news for the whole family." But even as he spoke the appropriate words, I sensed a restraint in his response that suggested he was processing the announcement more carefully than I'd anticipated, considering implications and complications that hadn't occurred to me when we were planning this moment. Stephen raised his water glass in a toast-like gesture. "To Uncle Stephen," he said with a grin that seemed authentic enough. "I'm looking forward to spoiling this kid rotten." Jessica smiled and nodded her agreement, but her expression remained carefully controlled in a way that made me wonder what she was really thinking about our announcement and what it might mean for her own family planning timeline. Tyler was the most genuinely enthusiastic, jumping up from his chair to come around the table and hug both Marcus and me with the kind of unrestrained joy that I'd been hoping to see from everyone. "This is amazing," he exclaimed. "I'm going to be the best uncle ever. I'm already planning fishing trips and camping adventures and all the stuff Dad never let us do when we were kids." His excitement was infectious and genuine, providing the celebratory energy that made the moment feel more like the happy family occasion I'd envisioned. But even Tyler's enthusiasm couldn't completely mask the underlying tension that seemed to settle over the table following our announcement. The conversation that followed felt polite rather than truly excited, with family members asking appropriate questions about due dates and doctor visits but not delving into the kind of detailed planning and anticipation that I'd expected would accompany news of the first grandchild. Patricia asked about my health, and whether I'd found a good obstetrician, practical concerns that demonstrated her care, but felt somewhat removed from the emotional excitement I'd hoped would characterize her response to becoming a grandmother. Robert inquired about our financial preparations and whether we felt ready for the additional expenses that came with raising children. Sensible questions, but ones that focused on logistics rather than joy and anticipation. Jessica's questions were the most carefully neutral, touching on general topics like whether we'd started thinking about nursery themes or baby names without expressing particular interest in our answers or offering to help with preparation activities. Her responses felt like someone going through the motions of appropriate family interest without genuine investment in the details or outcomes. The most telling moment came when Patricia began clearing the table and organizing dessert service, efficiently moving the conversation away from our pregnancy announcement and back to more general family topics. "Tyler, did you hear that the Hendersons are selling their place?" she asked, launching into a discussion about local real estate developments that effectively ended the focus on our news and returned the gathering to its typical pattern of community updates and family business. I participated in the continuing dinner conversation, but my attention was divided between the immediate social requirements and my growing awareness that our pregnancy announcement had been received with significantly less enthusiasm than we'd anticipated. The family members were all being polite and supportive, but their responses felt measured and careful rather than spontaneously celebratory, suggesting underlying concerns or complications that they weren't expressing directly. Marcus seemed to be having a similar realization, his initial relief at sharing our news gradually replaced by puzzlement about the family's muted response to what we considered the most exciting development in our lives. He attempted several times to bring the conversation back to pregnancy-related topics, asking for advice about preparing for parenthood and wondering aloud about family traditions that might be meaningful to incorporate into our daughter's upbringing. But each time he tried to refocus attention on our pregnancy, the conversation seemed to drift naturally back to other topics, almost as if the family was unconsciously avoiding extended discussion about the baby or what her arrival would mean for everyone's relationships and responsibilities. The pattern became so pronounced that I began to wonder whether we'd misread the family dynamics somehow, whether there were issues or concerns that we hadn't considered when planning our announcement. The drive home was quiet, both Marcus and I processing the gap between our expectations and the reality of how our news had been received. "That wasn't quite what I expected," Marcus finally said as we turned into our driveway. "I mean, they were happy for us, but it felt like they were holding back somehow. Like they were worried about something they didn't want to mention." I nodded, feeling relieved that he'd noticed the same dynamics that had left me confused and slightly disappointed. "Maybe they're just being cautious because it's still early in the pregnancy," I suggested, though I wasn't entirely convinced by my own explanation. "Or maybe they're worried about how we'll manage with our work schedules and everything." But even as I offered these rationalizations, I suspected that the family's response reflected more complex issues that we didn't fully understand yet. The phone call from Eleanor that evening provided a stark contrast to the family dinner experience. She was absolutely thrilled about our pregnancy news, asking detailed questions about my symptoms and experiences, sharing stories about other family babies she'd known and loved, and immediately beginning to plan for ways she could be involved in preparing for our daughter's arrival. "Oh, my dear," she said, her voice trembling with genuine emotion, "this is the most wonderful news I've heard in years. A baby, and a little girl, you think? How marvelous. I'm going to start knitting immediately, and I have some lovely children's books from when Harold's nephews were small. This baby is going to be so loved, Rebecca. So very, very loved." Eleanor's enthusiastic response reminded me of what I'd hoped the family dinner would feel like, filled with excitement and anticipation rather than careful politeness and measured responses. Her immediate offers to help with nursery preparation and her obvious joy about becoming a great-great-aunt provided the kind of family support that made the pregnancy feel like a shared celebration rather than a private achievement that others were acknowledging out of obligation. Over the following days, the contrast between Eleanor's ongoing enthusiasm and the Thompson family's more restrained response became increasingly apparent. Eleanor called regularly to check on my health and share ideas about baby preparations, while the Thompson family members returned to their usual patterns of occasional contact that didn't include much mention of the pregnancy or questions about how I was feeling as the weeks progressed. The pattern suggested that our pregnancy announcement had created different kinds of responses within the extended family network, with some members genuinely excited about the new addition while others seemed more focused on their own concerns and priorities. Eleanor's investment in our daughter's future stood out as particularly meaningful because it felt personal and emotional rather than simply polite and socially appropriate. The weeks following our announcement also revealed the extent to which Jessica's own fertility struggles were influencing family dynamics around pregnancy-related topics. Patricia mentioned in passing that Jessica and Stephen had been trying to conceive for several years, dealing with medical challenges that had made pregnancy elusive despite their best efforts, and considerable emotional investment in becoming parents. Understanding Jessica's situation helped explain some of the tension I'd sensed during our announcement dinner, though it also created new complications about how to navigate family interactions without inadvertently causing pain or resentment. My pregnancy represented not just a happy family development but also a painful reminder of what Jessica and Stephen were struggling to achieve, creating an undercurrent of comparison and competition that nobody wanted to acknowledge directly. The complexity of these family dynamics became more apparent as my pregnancy progressed and different family members found different ways to engage with the reality of our impending parenthood. Some relatives were genuinely supportive and excited, others seemed distracted by their own challenges and concerns, and still others appeared to view our pregnancy as just one of many family developments that deserved acknowledgement but not particular attention or investment. Eleanor's position as an enthusiastic supporter became increasingly important as I navigated these complicated family relationships and tried to maintain appropriate connections with everyone while protecting my own emotional well-being during a pregnancy that felt both precious and vulnerable. Her consistent excitement and practical support provided a foundation of family enthusiasm that helped compensate for the more ambivalent responses from other relatives. The experience of sharing our pregnancy news taught me important lessons about family expectations and dynamics that would prove crucial as our daughter's birth approached and we faced decisions about how to integrate her into extended family relationships that were more complex and fragile than I'd initially understood. The announcement had revealed underlying tensions and competing priorities that would influence family interactions for years to come, setting the stage for conflicts and complications that we couldn't yet imagine but would soon be forced to navigate. Part 6. The initial demand. The call came on a Tuesday morning in late October, 3 weeks after Eleanor's funeral and 2 weeks after the memorial service that had brought together relatives and friends from across the Pacific Northwest. I was in my classroom helping third graders with a science experiment involving growing bean sprouts in different types of soil, when my phone buzzed with Patricia's distinctive ringtone. I almost let it go to voicemail, given that I was surrounded by 8-year-olds who were deeply invested in measuring their seedlings and recording observations in their science journals. But something about the timing felt urgent, so I stepped into the hallway and answered while keeping one eye on my students through the classroom window. "Rebecca, dear." Patricia's voice carried an unusual formality that immediately put me on alert. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important, but Robert and I need to discuss some family matters with you and Marcus. Could you both come by the house this evening after dinner? There are some things about Eleanor's estate that we need to address as a family." The phrasing struck me as oddly official, considering that Eleanor's will had already been read and the legal matters seemed straightforward according to David Harrison's explanation. But Patricia's tone suggested this wasn't a casual request, so I agreed to check with Marcus and confirmed that we'd be there around 7 o'clock. The rest of the school day passed slowly, with my attention divided between teaching responsibilities and wondering what family matters could be so pressing that they required a special meeting just 2 weeks after we'd all gathered for Eleanor's memorial service. Marcus was equally puzzled when I called him at the fire station during his lunch break. "Mom didn't give you any hints about what this is about?" he asked, his voice reflecting the same confusion I was feeling. "Did she mention whether Stephen and Jessica would be there too? Or Tyler?" I realized that Patricia hadn't specified who else would be attending this family meeting, though her reference to discussing things as a family suggested that this would involve more than just the four of us. The drive to the Thompson farmhouse that evening felt different from our usual Sunday dinner visits, charged with an anticipation that wasn't entirely comfortable. The October air was crisp and clear, with the kind of autumn evening light that made everything look more dramatic than usual, but instead of appreciating the seasonal beauty, I found myself rehearsing possible explanations for this unexpected family conference and wondering what estate matters could require immediate attention from people who weren't named beneficiaries in Eleanor's will. We arrived to find Stephen and Jessica's car already in the driveway, along with Tyler's pickup truck and a vehicle I didn't recognize that turned out to belong to Michelle, Patricia's niece, who had driven down from Portland specifically for this meeting. The fact that Michelle had made the 2-hour drive on a weeknight suggested that whatever Patricia wanted to discuss was significant enough to warrant involving extended family members who wouldn't normally participate in routine Thompson family business. The house felt more formal than usual, with Patricia having arranged the living room furniture to accommodate the larger group and prepared coffee and desserts that created an atmosphere somewhere between a family gathering and a business meeting. Everyone was present when Marcus and I arrived, creating the kind of complete family assembly that typically occurred only during major holidays or significant life events. Patricia waited until we were all seated and served with coffee before beginning what was clearly a prepared presentation. "I asked everyone to come tonight because there are some concerns about Eleanor's will that I think we need to address together as a family," she began, her tone carrying the authority that came from being the acknowledged matriarch of the Thompson clan. "David Harrison has been very helpful in explaining the legal aspects, but there are practical considerations that affect all of us." She paused to look around the room, making eye contact with each family member in a way that suggested she'd rehearsed this moment and wanted to ensure she had everyone's complete attention. "As you all know, Eleanor's will names Rebecca's unborn child as the primary beneficiary of her estate, including the manor house and the 50 acres surrounding it. This is a significant inheritance, worth approximately $2.8 million according to the most recent appraisal." The figure was startling enough that several people shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. I'd known that Eleanor's estate was substantial, but hearing the actual dollar amount made the inheritance feel more real and more overwhelming than it had during the will reading when I was still processing the shock of being mentioned at all. Marcus reached over and squeezed my hand, a gesture that felt both supportive and protective given the serious expressions on everyone's faces. The legal reality, Patricia continued, is that this inheritance will be held in trust until Rebecca's child turns 18, with Rebecca and Marcus serving as trustees and having full control over the property and assets until that time. This means that they will essentially own and control Eleanor's entire estate for the next 18 years, making decisions about the manor house, the land, and the financial investments without input from the rest of the family. Robert cleared his throat and leaned forward in his chair, taking over the presentation in a way that suggested they'd planned this tag team approach to covering different aspects of their concerns. "What worries us," he said, his voice carrying the measured tone he used when discussing serious farm business, "is that this arrangement puts an enormous responsibility on Marcus and Rebecca, who may not be prepared for the complexities of managing such a substantial estate while also raising a young child. The implication that we might not be capable of handling Eleanor's inheritance felt like a challenge disguised as concern, though Robert's expression remained neutral enough that it was difficult to determine whether he was being deliberately insulting or simply expressing genuine worry about our ability to manage unfamiliar responsibilities. Marcus tensed beside me, and I could feel his protective instincts activating in response to what felt like questioning of our competence and judgment. Additionally, Patricia resumed, there are family considerations that Eleanor may not have fully appreciated when she made her will. The manor house has been a gathering place for Thompson family celebrations for decades, and many of us have strong emotional connections to the property that go back to childhood memories and important family milestones. There's also the practical matter of maintaining such a large property, which requires ongoing attention and resources that might be challenging for a young couple with a new baby. Jessica spoke for the first time since we'd arrived, her voice carefully modulated but carrying an undercurrent of emotion that suggested she'd been thinking about this situation extensively. What if something happened to Rebecca during childbirth, or if there were complications with the pregnancy? The inheritance would still go to the child, but who would be making decisions about the estate? Would Marcus have complete control, or would there be legal complications that could tie up the property for years? The question felt like a knife sliding between my ribs, not because it was malicious but because it voiced fears that I'd been trying not to think about during a pregnancy that felt both miraculous and precarious. The possibility of complications during delivery was something every pregnant woman considered, but having it raised as a concern about inheritance management rather than personal welfare made the question feel calculating rather than caring. Stephen cleared his throat and entered the conversation with the kind of
measured authority that characterized his role as the eldest son and presumptive leader of the next generation of Thompson family decision-making. "What we're proposing," he said, looking directly at Marcus and me, "is a family arrangement that would better reflect Eleanor's intentions while providing more security for everyone involved, including Rebecca and the baby." The word proposing sent alarm bells ringing in my mind, suggesting that this family meeting wasn't just about expressing concerns, but about presenting a plan that had been developed without our input or knowledge. Marcus's posture shifted beside me, his firefighter training making him alert to situations that might require quick response and decisive action. "We think Eleanor would want the manor house to remain a place where the entire family can gather and create memories," Patricia continued, "rather than becoming the private property of one branch of the family. So we'd like to suggest that Marcus and Rebecca consider donating the property to a family trust that would maintain it as a shared family asset while still providing financial benefits for the baby's future." Tyler, who had been unusually quiet throughout the meeting, finally spoke up with a question that cut straight to the heart of the matter. "Are you asking them to give up the inheritance? Because that's what it sounds like to me, and I don't think that's what Eleanor intended when she wrote her will." His directness created a moment of uncomfortable silence that revealed the underlying tension everyone had been trying to avoid addressing directly. Michelle, who as Patricia's niece had been included in the discussion but wasn't technically a Thompson family member, offered what appeared to be a compromise position. "Maybe there's a middle ground where Rebecca and Marcus could maintain legal ownership but agree to family input on major decisions about the property."
That way, they'd still control the inheritance, but the rest of the family would have some say in how Eleanor's legacy is preserved and maintained. The suggestion sounded reasonable on the surface, but I recognized it as the first step in a process that would gradually erode our authority over Eleanor's bequest until family consensus became more important than legal ownership. The idea of family input on decisions about property that belonged to my unborn daughter felt like a fundamental misunderstanding of both Eleanor's intentions and our responsibilities as trustees. Robert leaned back in his chair and adopted the patient expression he used when explaining complex farming concepts to people who weren't familiar with agricultural business. The reality is that managing a property like Hillcrest Manor requires knowledge and experience that most people don't have. There are historical preservation issues, property tax considerations, maintenance requirements that could easily cost tens of thousands of dollars annually. We're concerned that without proper guidance, the estate could become a financial burden rather than an asset. The condescension in his tone was unmistakable, even though his words were framed as helpful advice rather than direct criticism. The implication that we lacked the intelligence or resources to manage Eleanor's inheritance properly felt like an insult that demanded response, but I also recognized that reacting defensively would play into their narrative that we were too immature or unprepared for such significant responsibilities. Marcus finally spoke, his voice carrying the controlled calm that he used in emergency situations when clear thinking was more important than emotional response. "I appreciate everyone's concerns," he said, "but Eleanor made her wishes very clear in her will. She wanted this inheritance to go to our daughter, and she trusted us to manage it appropriately until she comes of age. I don't think it's our place to second-guess Eleanor's judgment or change arrangements that she spent considerable time and legal consultation developing." Patricia's expression tightened at Marcus's response, though she maintained the polite tone that had characterized the entire meeting. "Of course we respect Eleanor's wishes," she said, "but we also have to consider practical realities that she may not have fully anticipated. Eleanor was an elderly woman who had been living alone for many years. She may not have completely understood how complex it would be for a young family to manage such a substantial estate while dealing with all the demands of raising a child." The suggestion that Eleanor had been mentally diminished or incapable of making sound decisions about her own property felt like a line being crossed, transforming what had been presented as family concern into something that felt more like an attack on Eleanor's competence and judgment. I found myself becoming angry for the first time during the meeting, not just at the implication that we couldn't handle the inheritance, but at the disrespect being shown to a woman who had been sharp and decisive until the day she died. "Eleanor knew exactly what she was doing," I said, my voice carrying more heat than I'd intended. "She spent months thinking about this decision, consulting with her lawyer, and considering what would be best for the baby's future. She never mentioned having any doubts about our ability to handle the responsibility, and she never suggested that the rest of the family should have input into decisions about her property." Jessica shifted in her seat and exchanged a meaningful look with Stephen before speaking again. "But you have to admit that it's a lot of responsibility for people who have never dealt with estate management or property investment. What if you make decisions that end up costing the estate money or reducing the inheritance that's supposed to benefit your daughter? Wouldn't it be better to have experienced family members involved in major decisions to protect her interests?" The logic of her argument was seductive, appealing to parental protectiveness while simultaneously undermining our authority to make decisions about our own child's inheritance. But I could see the trap being constructed, where every choice we made would be subject to family review and approval, where our role as trustees would become subordinate to family consensus about what was best for Eleanor's legacy. Stephen took over the presentation at this point, pulling out a folder of documents that suggested this family meeting had involved considerably more preparation than we'd been led to believe. "We've actually consulted with a lawyer about setting up a family trust structure that would preserve the inheritance for your daughter while also maintaining the manor house as a place where the whole family can continue to gather and create memories." he said, spreading papers across the coffee table. This arrangement would protect the estate from potential mismanagement while ensuring that Eleanor's vision of family unity is preserved for future generations. The fact that they'd consulted with a lawyer and prepared legal documents without informing us felt like a betrayal that went beyond simple family disagreement into something that resembled a coordinated attack on our inheritance rights. Marcus stood up abruptly, his movement sudden enough that everyone in the room tensed in response to his obvious agitation. "You hired a lawyer to figure out how to take away our daughter's inheritance?" he asked, his voice rising for the first time during the meeting. "You're sitting here talking about Eleanor's wishes and family unity while you've been secretly planning to override her will and steal money that belongs to our child." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a fire that was just beginning to burn, creating a moment of shocked silence that revealed how far this family conference had strayed from the supportive discussion it had been presented as. Patricia rose from her chair as well, her face flushed with the kind of righteous indignation that suggested she genuinely believed she was defending family interests against unreasonable selfishness. "Nobody's trying to steal anything," she said, her voice sharp with emotion. "We're trying to protect this family from a situation that could tear us apart and ensure that Eleanor's legacy is preserved in a way that honors her memory and serves everyone's interests." The meeting deteriorated rapidly from that point, with accusations and defensive responses replacing the careful politeness that had characterized the earlier discussion. Tyler supported Marcus and me, arguing that Eleanor's will should be respected regardless of anyone's concerns about our ability to manage the inheritance. Michelle tried to maintain her position as a neutral mediator, but her suggestions for compromise felt increasingly irrelevant as the fundamental disagreement became clear. Robert's final statement before we left revealed the full extent of their expectations and the consequences they were prepared to impose if we didn't agree to their proposal. "We hope you'll take some time to think about what we've discussed tonight," he said, his tone carrying the weight of an ultimatum disguised as a request, "but you should understand that if you insist on maintaining complete control over Eleanor's estate, there will be family members who feel that you're putting your own interests ahead of what's best for everyone. That kind of selfishness could have long-term consequences for your relationships with people who love you and want to support you as you raise Eleanor's great-great-niece." The threat was subtle but unmistakable, suggesting that our refusal to share control of the inheritance would result in family isolation and loss of support during what should have been one of the most joyful periods of our lives. The drive home was silent, both Marcus and I processing the reality that Eleanor's generous bequest had transformed us from beloved family members into adversaries who were standing between other relatives and money they believed they deserved to control. Part 7 Pressure Campaign begins. The morning after the family meeting, I woke to find 3 missed calls from Patricia and a text message that simply read, "Please call when you have a chance. We need to talk." The tone was polite but persistent, suggesting that the previous evening's discussion had been viewed as an opening negotiation rather than a final presentation of their position. Marcus was already at the fire station for his 24-hour shift, leaving me to face whatever family pressure campaign might be developing without his immediate support and counsel. I decided to wait until after school to return Patricia's call, needing time to process the events of the previous evening and consider how to respond to what felt like an organized effort to pressure us into surrendering control of Eleanor's inheritance. My third-grade students provided a welcome distraction from family drama, their enthusiasm for learning and innocent joy in simple accomplishments serving as a reminder of what really mattered in life beyond money and property and family politics. But even during my busiest teaching moments, I found myself thinking about the documents Stephen had spread across the coffee table, the lawyer consultation that had occurred without our knowledge, and the carefully coordinated presentation that suggested considerable planning and preparation. The family meeting had been orchestrated rather than spontaneous, designed to present us with a fait accompli rather than engage us in genuine discussion about Eleanor's intentions and our responsibilities as trustees. The call to Patricia that afternoon revealed the next phase of their campaign, presented as loving concern but feeling increasingly like manipulation designed to wear down our resistance through persistence and emotional pressure. "I hope you're not upset about last night," Patricia began, her tone carrying the kind of forced cheerfulness that suggested she was working from a script. "We were just trying to help you understand all the complexities involved in managing Eleanor's estate." I assured her that we weren't upset, though that wasn't entirely true, and waited to hear what additional concerns she felt needed to be addressed. "The thing is," she continued, "Robert and I have been talking, and we're worried that you and Marcus might not fully appreciate how challenging it's going to be to maintain that big house and all that property while you're dealing with a new baby and all the demands of parenthood." The conversation that followed was a masterclass in gentle manipulation, with Patricia raising concern after concern about our ability to handle estate management, while presenting herself as a helpful family member who only wanted what was best for everyone involved. She talked about property taxes and maintenance costs, about the historical significance of the manor house and the family's emotional connection to the property, about the complexity of investment management and the risks of making financial mistakes that could reduce our daughter's inheritance. Each concern was presented as a loving worry rather than a criticism, but the cumulative effect was to create doubt about our competence and judgment, while positioning the family's proposed trust arrangement as the obvious solution to problems we might not even realize we were facing. Patricia was skilled at this kind of emotional manipulation, having had decades of practice managing family dynamics and getting her way through persistence and guilt rather than direct confrontation. "I just keep thinking about how overwhelmed you're going to be once the baby arrives," she said, her voice trembling with apparent emotion. "New mothers have so much to deal with, and adding the stress of managing a multi-million-dollar estate seems like it could be too much for anyone to handle. Wouldn't it be better to have family support and guidance during such an important time in your lives?" The phone call lasted nearly an hour, with Patricia cycling through various arguments and approaches while maintaining the facade of helpful concern. She mentioned Eleanor's age and possible confusion about the implications of her bequest, suggested that the inheritance was too large for any young couple to manage responsibly, and repeatedly emphasized the family's willingness to help if only we would accept their guidance and oversight. When I finally ended the call, promising to discuss everything with Marcus when he returned from his shift, I felt emotionally drained and increasingly frustrated with the family's refusal to accept Eleanor's clearly stated wishes. The pressure campaign had begun in earnest, and I suspected that Patricia's call was only the opening salvo in what would become a sustained effort to wear down our resistance through persistence and psychological manipulation. The next few days brought a steady stream of family contact that felt coordinated rather than spontaneous, with different family members calling at different times to express similar concerns, using slightly different approaches. Jessica called to share her worries about the impact of estate management stress on my pregnancy and the baby's health, suggesting that the emotional burden of such significant responsibility could create complications that might affect both of us. Stephen called to discuss the practical aspects of property maintenance and investment management, offering to share his business experience and financial knowledge if we would agree to include the family in major decisions about the estate. His approach was more technical than emotional, focusing on spreadsheets and cost analyses that painted a picture of overwhelming complexity that would be difficult for novices to navigate successfully. Tyler's call was different, more supportive of our position, but still expressing concern about the potential for family conflict if we insisted on maintaining complete control over Eleanor's inheritance. "I think Eleanor knew what she was doing," he said, "but I'm worried about what this is doing to the family. Mom and Dad are really upset, and Stephen and Jessica keep talking about legal options if you won't consider some kind of compromise." The mention of legal options was particularly disturbing, suggesting that the family was already consulting with attorneys about ways to challenge Eleanor's will or force us into arrangements that would give them control over the inheritance. The threat of litigation hung over our conversations like a storm cloud, creating pressure to negotiate rather than stand firm on Eleanor's clearly expressed intentions. Michelle called from Portland to offer what she presented as an outsider's perspective on the family situation, though her concerns aligned perfectly with those expressed by other family members. "I just think Eleanor would want the family to stay together," she said, "and this inheritance situation seems to be creating divisions that could last for years if you can't find some way to compromise." The suggestion that we were responsible for family divisions, rather than simply defending our daughter's inheritance rights, felt like blame shifting, designed to make us feel guilty about maintaining our legal position. But I was beginning to recognize the pattern of emotional manipulation that characterized all these family conversations, where legitimate concerns were mixed with guilt and pressure in ways that made it difficult to separate genuine worries from calculated attempts to change our minds. Robert's call was the most direct, presenting what amounted to an ultimatum disguised as a final attempt at reasonable discussion. "Rebecca," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to having his decisions respected and implemented, "I think you need to understand the position you're putting this family in. Eleanor's will has created a situation that could damage relationships that have been strong for generations." He went on to explain that the family had always operated as a unit, making important decisions through consensus and mutual support rather than individual authority. "The inheritance arrangement gave us power over family assets without family input, disrupting established patterns and creating potential for conflict that could affect everyone's relationships for years to come. What we're asking for isn't unreasonable," he continued. "We just want some input into decisions that affect property and assets that have family significance beyond their monetary value." The manor house has been a gathering place for Thompson family celebrations for decades. "Surely you can understand why we'd want some say in how it's used and maintained." The emotional manipulation was becoming more sophisticated, appealing to family loyalty and tradition, while framing our legal rights as selfish disruption of established harmony. But I was also beginning to see the deeper motivations behind the pressure campaign, particularly the financial benefits that would accrue to family members if they could gain control over Eleanor's substantial estate. The breaking point came when Jessica called with what she presented as a confidential warning about family discussions that were becoming increasingly hostile toward Marcus and me. "I probably shouldn't be telling you this," she said, her voice carrying the conspiratorial tone of someone sharing privileged information, "but some family members are starting to say that Eleanor must have been confused or manipulated when she wrote her will. They're talking about getting a psychological evaluation done posthumously to prove that she wasn't competent to make such a significant bequest." The threat to challenge Eleanor's mental competence felt like a line being crossed, transforming what had been pressure into something approaching character assassination of a woman who had been sharp and decisive until the day she died. The suggestion that we might have manipulated an elderly woman into changing her will was not only false but deeply insulting to both Eleanor's memory and our integrity. "I don't think it would go anywhere legally," Jessica continued, "but the family is really upset, and people are saying things about you and Marcus that aren't fair or accurate. I just thought you should know what you're dealing with if you decide to fight this, instead of trying to find some kind of compromise that everyone can live with." The call ended with Jessica's suggestion that we meet for coffee to discuss possible solutions that might satisfy everyone's concerns while preserving family relationships. The invitation felt like a trap, another opportunity for family pressure and manipulation disguised as supportive conversation between sisters-in-law who shared common interests in family harmony. When Marcus returned from his shift that evening, I shared the details of all the family conversations and the escalating pressure campaign that seemed designed to wear down our resistance through persistence and psychological manipulation. His reaction was immediate and decisive, reflecting both his protective instincts and his growing anger about the family's attempts to override Eleanor's clearly stated wishes. "They're treating us like criminals," he said, his voice tight with frustration. "Eleanor left that money to our daughter because she wanted her to have it, not because she was confused or manipulated. And now they're trying to make us feel guilty about accepting a gift that we never asked for and never expected." His protective anger was reassuring, confirming that he was prepared to stand firm against family pressure despite the emotional cost of family conflict. We decided that evening to contact David Harrison, Eleanor's lawyer, to discuss the family's legal threats and understand our rights and responsibilities as trustees of our daughter's inheritance. We also agreed to stop taking family calls about the estate, communicating instead through email or written correspondence that would create records of any threats or attempts at manipulation. The decision to limit family contact felt like a necessary protection of our emotional well-being and our daughter's financial future, but it also marked the beginning of a family estrangement that would prove to have consequences none of us could have anticipated when Eleanor first decided to name our unborn child as her primary beneficiary. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen.